I never expected my son to call me a stranger in my own home. It was a Sunday. Late spring. One of those crisp Pacific Northwest mornings where the air still smells faintly of wet cedar. I'd set the brunch table the way Robert liked it: honey roasted ham, the little croissants from that overpriced bakery in Queen, and the lemon curd I used to make when he was 10 and convinced it was pudding. He was already late. Mina had refolded the napkins 3 times. When Robert finally walked in, he didn't take off his shoes. That was my first warning. The second came a few minutes into small talk, when I mentioned my plans to convert part of the back lot into a wildlife easement. He set down his mimosa and gave me the look, the one his father used to give when he thought I was being sentimental. "Why would you waste that kind of land, Mom? You realize developers are paying $2 million an acre just across the freeway." I smiled thinly. That's exactly why it should stay wild. Not every acre has to be monetized. Robert leaned back, arms crossed. This is the problem. You treat property like it's sacred. You realize that kind of thinking is exactly why you don't get taken seriously anymore. Mina paused mid-pour behind him. I gave her a small nod to keep going. "You mean taken seriously by people like you?" I said, trying to keep my voice even. "By people who understand how the world works." The silence that followed was taut. I reached for my tea, fingers steady, though I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Robert stood and began pacing. "You know what? Do whatever you want. Just don't expect me to be a part of it. Honestly, I don't even know why I came. You act like you care about family, but it's always about your causes. It's like I'm not even your son anymore." I swallowed hard. That's a cruel thing to say. He shrugged. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before putting a forest ahead of your family." I looked at him, really looked, his suit tailored too sharp for a family brunch, his phone screen lighting up with texts he didn't bother hiding. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to check a box. "You said something important just now," I replied quietly. He narrowed his eyes. "What?" "That I'm not your family anymore." He laughed, sharp and joyless. "I didn't mean it literally, Mother. But sure, twist it. That's what you lawyers do, isn't it?" I stood up slowly, the chair creaking beneath me. "Well, it's good to know where we stand." He grabbed his blazer and muttered something about meetings and deadlines and how I shouldn't take everything so personally. I walked him to the door anyway. Old habits. When it clicked shut behind him, I didn't cry. I just stood there a moment, letting the silence settle. Then I turned to Mina, who had already begun clearing plates. "You've been with me longer than he's stayed in any one place," I said. She didn't respond right away. Just looked at me with those patient eyes. "He's your son." I nodded. "And you've been my witness." I didn't need time to think. I'd already known the moment Robert said it, that line about me not being family. It didn't hurt the way he probably wanted it to. It clarified. Blood makes kin. But character makes family. There's something oddly liberating about being disowned by your only child. For the first few days after Robert left, I didn't speak much. I cooked for one. I walked the property in long, slow circuits, past the pine grove I'd planted with my husband in 1983, down to the stream that still carried runoff from the hills behind the house. I listened to birdsong. I listened to silence. It's amazing how much space opens up when disappointment clears out. I wasn't angry. That would have been easier. Anger burns clean, but what I felt was more sedimentary, layered, and patient. A quiet grief, years in the making. Robert had once been the child who'd fallen asleep on my lap during court prep, who'd helped me staple copies of amicus briefs, who used to call my closing arguments magic spells. But sometime after college, the world taught him different values faster, louder ones. He traded books for contracts, conviction for capital. I don't blame him entirely. The world rewards exactly what he's become. But that doesn't mean I owe it anything. I opened the old safe that Tuesday, the one behind the bookshelf in the study. Inside were the original title deeds to the property, my late husband's will, and my own, a version last updated 9 years ago, before Robert's first land deal, before his values hardened into economics. I called Priya Bhattacharya that afternoon. She used to be my clerk, now a fine attorney in her own right, smarter than I ever was at her age, and 10 times more patient. "Ellie," she said when she picked up. "Are you okay?" "I need to revise my will," I said. "And I want it ironclad." There was a pause. What's happened? I just realized I've been measuring legacy by the wrong yardstick. By Thursday, she was sitting at my dining table with a laptop and a notary on standby. Mina made tea and left us alone, as always. I explained the new terms without emotion. I want to leave the entire estate, house, land, assets, to Mina. Priya blinked. All of it. 90%. I'll leave Robert some family heirlooms. A trust to cover any legitimate debts. But nothing he can sell, flip, or liquidate. She didn't respond right away. You're going to get challenged on this. I know. Are you doing this to punish him? No, I said. I'm doing it to honor someone who's shown up for me every day for 20 years. She never asked for anything. She earned everything. We sat in silence a while longer as Priya worked through the legal logistics, how to build in no-contest clauses, capacity assessments, documentation, and sworn affidavits from friends and colleagues. She was methodical, but I could tell she was watching me closely, scanning for any hint of diminished capacity that might haunt us later in court. Ellie, she said finally, are you sure? I've been sure since the moment he told me I wasn't family anymore. She nodded. We'll make it hold. That night, Mina brought me my tea and sat down, unusually tentative. I don't need anything, she said. I know, I replied. She looked down at her hands. You have a son. I had a son who thought the world owed him something. But I have a witness, a caretaker, a woman who has carried this home on her back without ever demanding things. I don't want to make trouble. You won't. I've built my life fighting for people who weren't supposed to have rights. This is no different. She wiped her eyes before she stood. We didn't speak of it again that night. But as I drifted off to sleep, I realized something that settled deep into my bones. This wasn't an act of rebellion. It was a return to form. The woman who used to stand before judges and argue for endangered ecosystems, for immigrant women escaping domestic violence, for children poisoned by lead pipes, she had gone quiet in retirement, lulled into the illusion that age equals irrelevance. But there is power in final acts. If the world refuses to see value where it isn't branded or born, then so be it. I would show it. With precision. With care. With the law. It rained the morning they read the will. Not a downpour, just a steady mist that blurred the windows and made the air feel heavier than it should have. Mina lit the fireplace without asking. She moved quietly through the living room, her presence more comforting than the condolences of distant cousins who'd stopped by the funeral out of obligation. Robert arrived 10 minutes late, as expected. Not dressed for mourning, no black, no tie. Just a trim navy suit, top button undone, confidence radiating off him like heat. He gave Mina a curt nod as he walked in, then ignored her completely. He didn't ask how I'd gone, though I imagine he knew. The stroke had come quickly, no drama, no fanfare. Just a silent exit after 73 years of calculated presence. I would have preferred more time, but some goodbyes are better written than spoken. Priya sat at the head of the table, flanked by a notary and 2 legal aides. Robert leaned back in his chair like he owned the place. Let's get through this, he said. Priya adjusted her glasses, her tone clipped and professional. As executor of Eleanor Cattry's will, I'm obligated to inform you that this is the final, legally binding version, witnessed, notarized, and documented on video 2 months prior to her passing. Robert didn't blink. I assume that means everything goes to me. Priya didn't flinch. Not quite. She began reading the document. Her voice was steady, formal, but every word felt like a chisel tapping away at something calcified in the room. To my son, Robert Cattry, she read, I leave the following, a first edition copy of Silent Spring, gifted to me by his father. My wedding ring. And a $20,000 trust held in escrow to cover any personal debts or liabilities as determined by the estate accountant. Robert sat upright, his smile faltering. To Meena Devi, Priya continued, I leave full ownership of my primary residence, including all land, mineral, and development rights therein. I leave the remaining financial assets in their entirety. This bequest is made not out of sentiment, but respect. Loyalty, kindness, and presence define family more than birthright. Silence pressed against the walls. Even the fire seemed to quiet. Robert laughed, sharp and incredulous. You're kidding. This is a joke, right? It's not, Priya said plainly. She was manipulated, he spat. There's no way my mother, no way, would give everything to a maid. Mina's head stayed low. Her hands were folded, motionless. You're welcome to contest the will, Priya said. Though I advise you read the full documentation. Mrs. Khatri was thorough. Medical evaluations, video testimony, and letters to the court have been filed in anticipation of a challenge. She was old, Robert snapped. People take advantage of old women. Priya's voice cooled. You're speaking about the woman who trained half this city's environmental lawyers. Including me. She knew exactly what she was doing. Robert stood, knocking his chair back. You think I'm going to let this go? You think this servant gets to walk away with my inheritance. She didn't walk away, Priya said. She stayed. That's the difference. He looked at Mina then, really looked, like seeing her for the first time not as furniture, but as a wall he hadn't expected. But she didn't flinch. She didn't gloat or plead. She simply held his gaze, steady and quiet. He stormed out without another word. Afterward, Mina stood by the window, arms crossed lightly. She didn't ask what would happen next. She didn't need to. She'd seen enough of the world to know that power rarely goes quietly. But I knew she would be ready. I didn't choose her to make a point. I chose her because family is not a matter of DNA or entitlement. It's who holds your hand without asking, who sees you when the world looks away, who remembers your real name when legacy tries to rewrite it. And I needed the world to remember mine. The first court notice arrived less than 3 weeks after the will was read. Robert wasted no time. His petition landed on Priya's desk with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer: claims of undue influence, testamentary incapacity, breach of fiduciary responsibility. The language was aggressive, performative. He wasn't just trying to overturn the will, he was trying to erase my judgment. I read the filing in silence, seated by the front window, the same place I used to edit trial briefs with a red pen and a scotch. The irony wasn't lost on me. After a lifetime of using the law to defend others, I'd left behind a case of my own. One last argument. One final lesson. Mina didn't say much when Priya told her. She nodded, lips tight, eyes calm. He'll try to break me, she said simply. He won't, Priya replied. You have more on your side than you think. Still, the legal machine began grinding forward. Discovery requests, depositions, character affidavits. Robert's attorneys, high-powered, high-priced, went on the offensive immediately. They subpoenaed my medical records, looking for any hint of mental decline. They requested bank statements, hoping to find suspicious financial transactions. They even tried to question my former cleaning staff, as if someone folding sheets could testify to manipulation. The strategy was obvious: paint Mina as a schemer, an opportunist who'd wormed her way into an old woman's affections, exploiting loneliness and confusion. They crafted a narrative where I'd become a doddering eccentric, incapable of knowing my own mind. But they underestimated 2 things: the clarity with which I'd prepared for this, and the strength of the woman they were trying to tear down. Priya assembled a formidable defense. She unearthed every evaluation I'd voluntarily completed: neurological, psychological, cognitive, all conducted before the final draft of the will. My scores had been sharp. My intentions clear. More importantly, she gathered character witnesses. Colleagues from my legal days. Former clerks. Judges I'd argued before. They all submitted statements. Each one attested not just to my competence, but to the deliberateness of my actions. She was sharper at 70 than I was at 40, wrote one appellate judge. Eleanor never did anything impulsively, said another. She planned her arguments the way a chess master sets a board. But the turning point, I think, was the letter. The one I'd given Priya, sealed and notarized, with instructions to file only if the will was contested. In it, I explained everything. I wrote of Mina's unwavering loyalty, her quiet intelligence, the way she bore witness to my life without judgment. I laid out the legal rationale. The inheritance was a moral acknowledgement, a final act of stewardship. I cited case law, not just on testamentary capacity, but on the ethics of legacy and domestic labor. I anticipated Robert's arguments and dismantled them with surgical precision. I have spent my life defending those without institutional power, I wrote. I see no reason to stop simply because the law now happens to be about me. When the court read that into the record, something shifted. Even Robert seemed shaken. He hadn't expected a rebuttal from beyond the grave. He certainly hadn't expected one with footnotes. But his team pressed on. They called Mina to testify, hoping to fluster her. She walked into the courtroom in a plain navy blouse and gray slacks. No jewelry. No makeup. She spoke softly, clearly, never defensive. "No, I never asked for anything," she said when questioned. She offered. "Did you ever try to influence her decisions?" "I didn't need to. She made her own." "Did you know she was planning to leave you the estate?" "I suspected she might. But I didn't expect it." "And how long have you been in this country?" 21 years. "Legally?" "I came on a tourist visa and overstayed," she said, not flinching. "It was a mistake I couldn't undo without leaving. So I stayed and worked. Quietly. Honestly." They thought they had her cornered with that admission, but they didn't know the groundwork I'd laid. Months before my death, Priya and I had begun consulting an immigration specialist to pursue a path for Mina under humanitarian relief provisions. It was slow, but it was real. Mina wasn't undocumented by choice. She was trapped by a system built on silence. The courtroom was quiet after her testimony. Not sympathetic, but not hostile either. Just still. Robert testified too, of course. He was polished, charming, performative. He used words like betrayed and family legacy and manipulation. But he stumbled when asked specifics. He couldn't recall the last time we'd had dinner alone. He didn't know the name of the woman who'd cared for me through my cancer treatment 6 years prior. He didn't know that woman was Mina. Intent matters in court. But so does presence. And Robert had been absent for years. They thought the truth would scare her into silence. After the second week of filings, Robert's legal team shifted strategy. They stopped trying to discredit me and started focusing on Mina's immigration status. It was the oldest trick in the book. When you can't attack the facts, attack the person. Paint her as a fraud, a fugitive, someone who didn't deserve kindness, let alone an inheritance. The papers started calling her the undocumented maid who inherited a mansion. Headlines that bled innuendo but offered no substance. Reporters lingered at the gate, hungry for scandal. Some even knocked on neighbors' doors asking how often they'd seen the maid outside. Mina endured it all without raising her voice. I'd known her story, of course. Not all the details, not at first. But enough. She came from Suva, Fiji, grew up the oldest of 5 girls, raised in a house with a leaking roof and a mother who taught English at the local convent school. Her visa was real when she arrived, but she'd stayed beyond its terms to care for her aunt, who was dying in Spokane. That choice to stay, to care, made her illegal in the eyes of a country that never asked why. By the time she found work with me, she'd already learned how to live invisibly. Always early, never loud. Paperless, but not careless. I didn't ask about her status the first year. But I noticed things. How she never left the house without a purpose. How she kept a small stash of cash hidden in a can of chickpeas in the pantry. The silence she wrapped around her like armor. Eventually, one night after I'd come home late from the hospital, still shaken from my biopsy, she sat across from me and told me the truth. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for anything. She just wanted me to know. "You've been more honest than most citizens I know," I told her. And I meant it. That honesty, of course, made her vulnerable in court. Robert's attorneys tried to spin it. They called her presence unlawful, her relationship with me coercive by dependency. They implied that she had manipulated me through guilt, that her immigration status created a power imbalance I should have known better than to act upon. But truth doesn't always bend. We responded with the documentation we'd been compiling quietly for months, letters from former employers, character references from community members, proof of continuous residence. Even early drafts of humanitarian parole requests that Priya had filed under the Violence Against Women Act's lesser-known provisions for caregivers. One statement in particular stood out, from a nurse who'd worked my cancer ward and remembered Mina by name. She never left her side, the nurse wrote. Even when visiting hours ended, she'd sleep upright in the corner chair, wake before the doctors. I assumed she was family. The court read that aloud. Robert's team tried again with icy threats, but we'd already initiated the right channels. Priya brought in an immigration lawyer who filed a stay on any removal orders until the estate litigation was resolved. Legally, they couldn't touch her. Emotionally, though, that was another matter. Meena stayed mostly inside. She stopped answering the phone. The mail piled up on the hallway table. But she never once asked to walk away. Not even when someone spray-painted "thief" on our stone mailbox. Not even when Robert left a voicemail saying, "This won't end the way you think it will." She saved that message. We submitted it into evidence. Meena never retaliated. She didn't even raise her voice when reporters cornered her on the sidewalk. She'd just say, "I'm respecting her wishes," and keep walking. Dignity isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep showing up anyway. That's what Meena did. She showed up. For years. And now, in a courtroom full of men who'd never asked her name before this case, she was showing them who she was, without apology, without performance, without anger. They'd tried to uncover her past. All they found was integrity. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and varnished wood, the kind of scent that makes time feel slower. I'd spent most of my life in rooms like that, fighting for clean water, for burial rights, for salmon migration protections, but never imagined I'd become the subject of a legal proceeding myself. Then again, maybe that's how legacy works. It circles back around. Priya had warned Meena that the hearing would be drawn out. These things often are. When the stakes are emotional and financial, the proceedings move like molasses. The judge, an older man named Abernathy, quiet and exacting, didn't allow theatrics. Thank God for that. Robert had come dressed for a spectacle. He entered each day with the posture of a man auditioning for a jury that didn't exist. Tailored suits, prepared sound bites, little glances to the gallery. But Abernathy wasn't interested in drama. He wanted precedent. He wanted motive. He wanted the will to speak for itself. And it did. When Priya read my letter into the record, the room fell still. I had taken days to write it, measured, composed, legal, but deeply personal. To the court, I began, "I submit this statement not as an emotional outburst, but as an articulation of my intention, informed by decades of legal practice and a life spent in the service of justice." I explained my relationship with Meena, her care, her presence, her silence that spoke louder than any plea. I documented Robert's absence in the last decade, his increasing detachment, his transactional mindset. I quoted the law, RCW 11.12.010, affirming testamentary freedom, Estate of Jones versus Mahoney, affirming that estrangement justifies divergence from traditional inheritance. "I am of sound mind," I wrote. "And my decision is neither reactive nor reckless. It is rooted in the belief that family is not only blood, but consistency, loyalty, and the quiet labor of care." When Priya finished, no one moved for a full 10 seconds. The prosecution, Robert's attorneys, regrouped quickly. They knew the letter was strong. They tried instead to hammer inconsistencies in Meena's timeline, implying that she had begun influencing me years before the will change. Their theory, thin but persistent, was that Meena had orchestrated my isolation in order to become indispensable. They brought in expert witnesses, body language analysts, even a so-called elder care consultant who'd never met me but was willing to opine that Meena's presence constituted informal but potentially coercive dependence. Priya dismantled them one by one. She introduced my longtime physician, who testified that my cognitive clarity had not only been intact, but superior to many younger patients. She called on friends, colleagues, even rivals, who spoke to my precision, my preference for control, and my disdain for emotional manipulation. Then came Character Witness Day. That's when things began to shift. An old environmental client of mine, Ruth Chin, took the stand. Ruth, now in her 80s, used to live 3 doors down. Her testimony wasn't legal, it was human. "I used to bring Eleanor the morning paper when she was recovering from surgery," she said. "I'd knock, and Meena would be the one to answer. She never left Eleanor's side. Not once. You don't manipulate someone by feeding them broth at 3 a.m. You do it because you care." The judge let that statement sit unchallenged. Next came the emails. Dozens of them, correspondence between Priya and me, time-stamped, methodical, showing the timeline of estate planning that began long before Mina was even aware of it. Priya laid it out clearly. The will was not an impulse. It was a legal act shaped over a year, with full capacity and clarity. Robert's testimony, by contrast, felt strained. He attempted sincerity, but when asked to provide examples of recent involvement in my life, he fumbled. He mentioned a vacation we never took. Claimed he'd brought me to a doctor's appointment I'd attended alone. Said he'd spoken with Mina all the time, though Mina had documented, time-stamped logs of his absence. Abernathy asked him a simple question during cross. Can you name your mother's favorite book? Robert paused. To Kill a Mockingbird? Priya rose, calm and crisp. Your Honor, the decedent's favorite book, as stated in the will and confirmed by 3 witnesses, was Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, a copy of which was bequeathed to Mr. Cattray. He appears not to have read it. Abernathy didn't respond. He didn't have to. The point had been made. Still, the case wasn't a slam dunk. These things never are. The law requires more than truth, it demands rigor. Motive matters. Procedure matters. And that's where Priya excelled. Every witness had been prepped. Every document indexed. Every fact cross-referenced. Not to manipulate, but to withstand scrutiny. The final day was short. Each side delivered closing arguments. Robert's attorneys leaned hard into inheritance as tradition. Bloodlines. Expectations. They called the case a perversion of legacy. Priya rose slowly. She didn't raise her voice. This case isn't about inheritance, she said. It's about intent. And every piece of evidence shows that Eleanor Cattray, lawyer, mother, citizen, knew exactly what she was doing. She made a lawful choice grounded in conscience. She gave her home to the person who had become her home. That landed like a gavel. Afterward, Mina and Priya sat quietly together in the hallway, saying little. Robert didn't wait for the decision. He left before the bailiff even dismissed the room. I didn't need to see the verdict to know which way it would go. The court had heard me. And finally, it had heard her too. It started with a podcast. Some local true crime show that usually covered cold cases and zoning scandals, nothing fancy, just 2 journalism grads with decent microphones and an eye for overlooked stories. They'd caught wind of the case through court filings and ran a segment called The Will That Broke a Bloodline. It wasn't sensationalist. If anything, it was careful. They read excerpts from my letter to the court. They interviewed one of the nurses from my cancer treatment. They even managed to get a 5-minute voice memo from Priya. Within 48 hours, it went viral. Listeners, especially women, latched onto the story. A powerful woman rewriting her legacy in quiet defiance of social norms. A son who expected loyalty as inheritance. A housekeeper who never asked for anything and ended up with everything. And they didn't stop there. Articles followed. Not tabloids, but well-written pieces in places like The Atlantic and The Guardian. Think pieces about labor, about what it means to love someone in silence. One column asked, what do we owe the people who witness our lives without asking for credit? Public sentiment began to lean. At first it was cautious. We don't know the whole story. There are always 2 sides. But then people started listening to Mina speak. She gave one short interview, trembling, her voice small but steady. She said, I just tried to be kind. She didn't have to thank me. That was all. No rebuttals. No performance. And that humility pierced something. The narrative turned. Not all at once, not with trumpets. But subtly. Like a tide pulling away from Robert and toward Mina. People noticed how he smirked during interviews, how he talked about assets and strategic miscalculations instead of grief or memory. They noticed how he framed inheritance as a transaction and how Mina refused to speak about money at all. I never cared for public opinion while I was alive. The law was my measure, not applause. But I understood its weight. Public opinion has a gravitational pull. Judges don't rule by it, but they feel its presence in the room. By the time the court was ready to rule, the story had grown beyond us. It had become a referendum on something deeper, what we value, whom we honor, who gets to be remembered. One morning, just after the final hearing, Mina found a letter in the mailbox. No return address. Just a note written in shaky, cursive pencil. I've cleaned houses for 37 years. You make me feel seen. Thank you. She kept that one. Slipped it into a book on the shelf next to Silent Spring. Because public sentiment wasn't about winning people over. It was about being understood, even briefly, by strangers who knew what it felt like to be invisible. The ruling came down on a Thursday morning. Cloudless sky. Unseasonably warm for March. I imagine the courthouse steps baking in sunlight, the brass door handles too hot to touch without a sleeve. Mina wore gray again, simple cotton, no makeup. She clutched a folder of papers she no longer needed. Priya walked beside her, unreadable as ever. The judge's opinion was 67 pages. Abernathy had written it himself, no ghosting, no shortcuts. That was rare. But maybe he understood this case wasn't just procedural. It was generational, emotional, a crack in the conventional logic of inheritance. He ruled in our favor. The will stood. Entirely. No conditions modified, no bequests revoked. He upheld the language, the intention, the documentation. He even cited my letter, called it a lucid and deliberate articulation of legacy. Robert's claims were deemed unsubstantiated and lacking compelling evidence of undue influence or diminished capacity. Mina didn't cry. She just exhaled so deeply it shook her shoulders. Priya put a hand on her back, one small gesture in a courtroom built for cold declarations. Robert wasn't there. His attorneys accepted the judgment with curt nods and began murmuring about appeals and next steps. They never made eye contact with Mina. Outside, reporters waited. But Mina didn't stop. She walked right past them, down the steps, into the car Priya had arranged. The cameras caught only the side of her face, turned away. She didn't speak to the press that day, didn't gloat, didn't perform gratitude. She came home, changed into soft clothes, and started dusting bookshelves. I don't think she knew what else to do with herself. That night, Priya stayed for dinner. Leftovers and herbal tea. The silence was warm. Mina brought out a small wooden box I'd once kept in my nightstand drawer. I found this in the back of the linen closet, she said. Inside were old family photos, Robert as a child on my hip, my husband planting our first trees on the property, Mina herself in the background of nearly every shot, always just outside the frame. I should have given this to you sooner, I'd written on a note taped inside the lid. She closed the box gently. He's not done, she said. No, Priya replied. He'll appeal. He'll run out of funds before he runs out of entitlement. And he did appeal, of course. But half-heartedly. The media tide had shifted. Donors backed away. His venture partners grew uneasy. His face disappeared from podcast thumbnails and panel events. The image of the ambitious heir challenging the quiet housekeeper didn't age well. 3 months later, his latest real estate project folded under zoning violations and bad press. Not karma, just consequence. A man who couldn't imagine the limits of power found them mapped across his own arrogance. Mina began working with a nonprofit that specialized in transitional housing for immigrant women. Not because she needed to, because she couldn't bear the weight of stillness. She donated a portion of the estate to fund a small shelter on the edge of town. The rest she kept conservatively, methodically. The house never felt empty. If anything, it settled into its silence like a deep breath held too long finally released. On the edge of the property, near the trail I used to walk, Mina planted a row of cherry trees. She placed a small wooden bench nearby. One of those brass plaques anchored to the backrest, the kind you only notice when you lean forward to stretch. It read, "To those who chose justice over blood." I don't know if Robert ever saw it. I don't think he comes around anymore. But one day, Mina found a letter tucked beneath the cushion. No envelope. Just a single line, written in what she recognized as his handwriting. You were always more hers than I was. No signature. No apology. Just truth, raw and late. She burned it in the fireplace without a word. Because some peace isn't meant to be shared. It's meant to be protected. And justice, real justice, isn't a moment. It's a life quietly rebuilt from the ruins of what others thought you didn't deserve. It's strange, the way memory settles into a place. Not in the rooms where events happened, necessarily, but in the spaces in between. The shadow of a handprint on a windowsill. The softness of a chair worn smooth by years of waiting. The silence after the last argument, heavier than any scream. Mina never redecorated. She changed a few things, replaced the threadbare carpets, repainted the back porch, but the bones of the house remained as they were. Not out of nostalgia, but respect. This wasn't a trophy. It was a trust. She didn't host galas or press tours. She let the story fade, quietly, the way all storms eventually do. People stopped asking about the will. The headlines dulled, the public's attention moved elsewhere. But every few months, a letter would arrive. Usually handwritten. Always private. One came from a retired nurse in Calgary. Another from a daughter who'd watched her immigrant mother clean houses for decades and never be named in a single Christmas card. Most said the same thing, in one way or another. You reminded me that dignity is real, even when it isn't visible. Mina read them all. She saved the ones that mattered. The rest she recycled, just as I would have. The cherry trees bloomed early that spring. White petals dusted the trail like snow. A local artist carved wooden signs for the sanctuary she helped fund, a home for women with no legal papers, no savings, no one to call. The name she chose was simple, Eleanor House. She resisted it at first. Said it was too much. Said I wouldn't have wanted the attention. And she was right. I wouldn't have. But legacies aren't about attention. They're about continuity. They're about someone taking the quiet work you've done and carrying it forward, not because they were asked, but because they understand it matters. And so, the work continues. Not in courtrooms or editorials, but in warm kitchens and quiet shelters. In the act of opening a door without needing to ask where someone came from. In choosing, day after day, to see people as they are, entire and worthy. Mina walks the trail most mornings. Pauses by the bench. Sometimes she brings tea. Sometimes a book. She never stays long. Just long enough. The plaque remains. The words unweathered. To those who chose justice over blood. Not a condemnation. Not even a warning. Just a record. That once, in a house on a hill, a woman rewrote what family meant. Not to erase the past, but to claim the future. Carefully. Deliberately. And she was heard.